face another inflection point in our nation's history, one that's going to determine what this country looks like several decades from now. You know, this is a time for choosing. Will we choose democracy over autocracy, or community over chaos, love over hate? These are the questions of our time that I ran for president to try to help answer, and that Dr. King's life and legacy, in my view, show us the way forward.
Hi again, everybody. It's 5 o'clock in the East. It's a holiday, right? It is officially a holiday today. Maybe your kids are home from school. Maybe if you're lucky, you've got the day off work today. But today, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, is in truth entirely unlike any other holiday that we observe as a nation. Because today's the day we celebrate and remember an unparalleled American icon, an all-time champion of human rights, of freedom, of good, who earned his place in the pantheon of America's most essential historic figures as a result of tireless, difficult, brutal efforts to elevate the wrongfully oppressed. He saw our country for exactly what it was, what it really was. He was murdered for trying to help it become what it could and should be. Undoubtedly, one of the best ways we can honor his legacy today is to look around and think about it. If Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were alive today, what would he see? What would he say? Would he see a fully functioning democracy in good health, where all voices carry equal weight, with easy access to the ballot box? Or, as he did decades ago, would he see us for exactly what we are, what we're struggling with right now? A nation in the midst of a bombardment, besieged by anti-democratic forces, some of them holding our nation's highest political offices. There is a brand new voter ID law in Ohio. There are a pair of new bills in Texas that would make it easier for that state's attorney general to prosecute what he considers, quote, election-related crimes, even though he couldn't find any. And in Wisconsin, an official sent out an email to 1,700 people bragging about a decrease in voter turnout among Black and Hispanic voters in heavily blue Milwaukee. All that just happened in the last week. Crucially, the right's endeavor to make it harder to vote in America, an endeavor that disproportionately hurts Black and brown voters, has surged, despite even a shred of evidence suggesting widespread voter fraud. And yet, still, more than 2 years after the most secure presidential election in our nation's history, pro-Trump forces are still blaming fraud for Trump's landslide defeat. Just last week in Pennsylvania, under pressure from conspiracy theorists and election deniers there, 28 Lycoming County employees did a hand recount of nearly 60,000 ballots. 3 days later, the results are in. Donald Trump gained, wait for it, 8 votes on President Joe Biden, changing the final tally by 1/100th of a point. Republicans might spend today sharing the only Martin Luther King quote many of them seem to know, that we ought to judge a person by the content of his or her character, not the color of his skin. But their ongoing assault on our democratic freedoms is antithetical to everything Dr. King fought for and stood for. And so, as ever, it's all hands on deck for pro-democracy forces. So let's take some advice from Dr. King.
Well, life for none of us has been a crystal stair, but we must keep moving. If you can't fly, run. If you can't run, walk. If you can't walk, crawl. But by all means, keep moving.
Oh, keep moving. That's where we begin this hour with some of our favorite friends. Democratic Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of Texas is here. Also joining us, former Republican Congressman David Jolly. And Jason Johnson's here. He's a politics and journalism professor at Morgan State University. David and Jason are MSNBC contributors. Congresswoman, I love calling you that. Congresswoman Crockett, you know, we thought of you. We watched that together as a team this morning. And you literally, physically, with your colleagues, moved from Texas to Washington to do something. It wasn't just what you said about the voter suppression law in Texas. It was about what you did. And I wonder how you plan to bring that to Washington.
First of all, it's great to see you and to finally be sworn in. You know, it's interesting because you talk about them giving a quote. And the quote that comes to my mind oftentimes is injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And that's exactly what we see. That's exactly what we saw when we decided to flee the state of Texas. It wasn't just a Texas thing. There was an injustice. There was a threat to it right there in the state of Texas. But as you covered, we saw these bills actually move and maneuver their way through state houses throughout the entire country. And most recently, we saw what happened in Brazil. And so for whatever reason, we need our MLK of today, which is really sad, because these are fights that so many of those civil rights warriors talk about. We thought we had won certain fights, but instead, seemingly, we have turned back the hands of time, and we are starting all over.
Congresswoman, I've said this on the show before. When Georgia passed its voter suppression law, they called it an election integrity law. But as we know, as is well storied now, there was no fraud in Georgia. That's why Brad Raffensperger, on the other end of the other perfect call with Trump, refused to find 11,780 votes. All the same, they were pressured by the political tides of Trumpism to pass a voter suppression law there. Now, Gabe Sterling and others are really quick to point out their great turnout numbers, and that is a good thing. But the fact that Republicans moved the goalpost predicated on a lie about fraud, forcing Democratic activists to re-educate their voters every 2 years about how to vote, is a slow-moving voter suppression. I mean, it is still moving away from where a healthy democracy should go, which is to make it easier to access the polls. And I wonder how you fight something that was so offensive at the time. Major League Baseball moved the All-Star game out of the state of Georgia. And then, like all Republican wounds and assaults on democracy, they do such a volume business. The country moved on. But there are more than 400 voter suppression laws winding their way through 48 states. How do we push back against that?
Yeah, so obviously we've got a dysfunctional U.S. House right now. So obviously I'm working really hard to make sure that we take the majority back in 2 years. But the question is, what do we do right now? And so for me, what I'm looking at and what my team is studying is the states that have maybe small portions, things such as same-day voter registration. How many states have that? Or looking at online voter registration. How many states have that? And see if we can get some bipartisan support and say, hey, Congressman such and such from whichever Republican state, why don't you stand with me and say that this is a good thing, this is a healthy thing for democracy? And so I don't think that we're really in the best position to get an omnibus bill. We had that amazing omnibus. We had two major omnibus bills that, went through the House, but unfortunately got nowhere in the Senate. And so right now I am just going to take out whatever little bites I can take out. And I hope and pray that that will absolutely make voting more accessible in states such as Texas. These very small things definitely make a difference when it comes to increasing voter turnout. And you talk about Georgia and them, really wanting to, I guess, take their victory lap and claim, hey, see, we did the right thing. But as far as I'm concerned, there absolutely was still voter suppression. We know that some of these crazy bills about how you can kick people off the rolls or challenge them. I went down to help Warnock in his election. And so I was actually calling and telling people that their ballots had been rejected and teaching them how to cure those ballots. There were a lot of extra steps for people who had never been rejected before, but all of a sudden they were rejected most likely because somebody decided to challenge them because they were voting in, say, a black area or voting in a Democratic area. Those are the kind of challenges that we're dealing with. And the fact that Georgia is organized enough to fight back doesn't mean that the fight isn't on. And we need to make sure that we're not fighting, but we're providing accessibility.
Jason Johnson, your thoughts on all of this?
So yesterday we know that the president gives this big speech at Ebenezer, and he talks about voting rights and all these sorts of important things. This is where I am on this, honestly, Nicole. We talk about this every MLK Day. We talk about what would he think about what's happening in this country now. What would he think about voting rights? He'd be sad. Of course, he was sad when he died. He was sad when he killed because he saw that America was not nearly as close to his dream as he wanted it to be. And I think we consistently sort of downplay how far off we really are from what MLK hoped this country would be. I'm sure he would be shocked and disgusted at what happened on January 6th, and equally shocked and concerned that so many people haven't been held accountable. I'm sure he would be uncomfortably familiar with the voter suppression that we see in Georgia and Florida and Texas and think, goodness gracious, it's been 70 years. Hasn't this stuff gotten better? I mean, those are the kinds of things that I tend to think about on MLK Day. And so when the president gives a speech or when Republicans send their random disingenuous gaslighting tweets, I just sort of sit back and say it's going to be the exact same thing next year. Unless there is a radical change in how Americans decide to see their government, and that comes from the ground and that comes from people in office, unless people recognize that our current democracy isn't just under threat because of terrorists, isn't just under threat because of a former president, but is under threat because you have a significant number of people in the House and Senate who don't actually believe in a functional multicultural democracy, then we will continue to have these conversations on MLK Day about what we wish was happening, but the people in a position to make the change don't have the strength and the ideological creativity to make any of those dreams come true.
Jason, let me just follow up with you. And I know this isn't what you're saying. We talk about this every single day, not an annual conversation on this show. And I just want to press you to flesh this out. I mean, when we covered the unsuccessful push for federal voting rights legislation, one thing that people would say is, Mark Elias will deal with it in the courts. Mark Elias would tell you, he's playing legal whack-a-mole, and that is a slow process as well.
Right.
Another thing people would tell me is, we'll just teach our voters, well, as Jasmine's saying, we'll sit, and Jasmine will do this, we'll sit with them and we'll tell them why their ballot was rejected and tell them where to go. That is the Republicans winning, too. Even if you sue them and win, even if you teach, a handful of voters how to vote anyway, they have already won. They've already changed the game. And I remember Republicans called me after 2020, and they said, well, what kind of voter integrity law would you be happy with? I said, none. There isn't any voter fraud, and it's already a crime. We have criminal statutes in every state and every locality and at the federal level. If you vote illegally, it's a crime. And you know who commits those crimes? Republicans, Trump voters. So how do we inject reality, and how do we make the democracy agenda? I mean, it's insane to me that only Democrats are fighting for voting rights in America. How do we make that? How do you take the partisanship out of access to the polls?
I don't think you can take partisanship out of it, because really the partisanship is just a proxy for racism. I mean, let's be clear. When you have voter suppression laws in a place like Ohio, you have, and we've seen this sociologically, that there's a certain segment of white people in America who would rather have their own lives inconvenienced than run the risk of black people being on an equal plane. Because frankly, all these voter suppression laws, they hurt white people too. Right? The intention is to keep black people from voting, but it inconveniences everybody. I am very sure that somebody living in Lorain, Ohio doesn't like the fact that their ID cards and things don't work the way they used to as well. So the way that you solve this problem is that the party leadership, and whether that's Joe Biden or formerly Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer, any of these people, they have to start saying this is not an issue of compromise. The rhetoric has to start there. It has to say voting rights is fundamental. This is not something we can negotiate. This is what I was saying, Nicole. We would have these conversations on this show. Start calling out Joe Manchin, because you know what? Coddling him didn't get anywhere. We still won't get any voting rights laws passed. But if the leadership is always ready to compromise, if the leadership, to use the sort of religious imagery, if the leadership is always willing to tell activists, hey, make your own bricks, right? Make your own straw, make your own bricks. As long as leadership is willing to put this on the shoulders of activists rather than saying this is not something that we will compromise on anymore, that is why you have these problems. You have too many people, you have Democrats right now in the House and in the Senate who say, yes, voting rights are important, but look, we won anyway. You can't keep winning that way. You can't keep winning on last-second field goals, because at some point you're going to miss. And that's where I see the real concern is I don't see urgency. The first thing Joe Biden should have said is that, hey, we've got the Senate now. I know we've lost the House, but let's start talking about voting rights. It's not even on the tip of their tongues until it's time to go to a historic black church and have this conversation. And that's why people get frustrated, and that's why you have low turnout, and that's why Milwaukee ends up the way it is, and that's why Mandela Barnes ended up not winning, and that's why black candidates in North Carolina didn't end up winning. It's almost as if the Democrats don't realize that this is the methodology they need to engage in to win, and instead they want to compromise with people who don't want to vote for them anyway, who don't believe in democracy.
Yeah.
So, David Jolly, this is where I wish Democrats would fight like Republicans. So what Republicans do is even the acceptable Republicans, right? Even the Brad Raffenspergers and Gabe Sterlings and that kind of Republican who are acceptable in the eyes of some people. I know not Jason Johnson's eyes, but they push back against Trump. They passed voter suppression legislation predicated on a lie. And what Republicans do, and you and I know this because we were in the party, is they take these extremist positions so that the compromise with Democrats is all the way over here. What Democrats have going for them is one, it is the only democratic thing to do, expand access to the polls. Two, we already have protections against fraud. They're crimes everywhere, as I said, at a local level, state level, and a federal level. Three, 65% of Americans think it should be easier, not harder to vote. What is, in your view, the political and legislative plan to pass federal voting rights legislation?
So, look, Democrats right now have to play defense and offense. And I think that's important, right? Jason's words are absolutely right. There's also a lens, though, to recognize the success Democrats have had in being a backstop at the federal level to prevent further Republican inroads into voter suppression. Because the natural tendency of Republicans is to suppress the vote in communities of color. They don't want as many black and brown people voting as actually turn out, so they start out each cycle trying to determine how to suppress it. And they do it in race-neutral ways, right? Even Brad Raffensperger, for instance, can embrace voter integrity legislation because it's race-neutral. But the reality is it does have a disproportionate impact on communities of color when you eliminate weekend voting, when you increase the ID requirements, when you put restrictions on who can transport a voter to the polls. It does impact everybody, as Jason said, but it has a disproportionate impact on communities of color, and Republicans intend for it to be that way. So Democrats step into this moment of history, and what are they doing? First, understand the accomplishment of playing defense and of being that backstop to at least thwart the worst tendencies of today's Republican Party. And the reason that you don't have partners at the federal level, particularly among Republicans, but even call him a conservative Democrat, Joe Manchin, is because the success the states are having at voter suppression. And the Republicans want it that way, and Joe Manchin buys the federalism notion that somehow states need to keep control of this. States only have control of elections until they begin to violate people's voting rights and civil rights. And where the courts have refused to step in, the Congress and the Senate have an opportunity to. Good for Joe Biden for staying on message. Good for Democrats in the House like the Congresswoman and the Senate for staying on message. The votes aren't there, but you can't stop now. And that's probably the lesson of today, most of all, for where we are. You can't stop now. You got to keep going.
Congresswoman, I'll give you the last word.
I'm sitting here, I'm having church right now. So thank you to this entire panel. No, but seriously, the idea that we go out and we celebrate and we talk about how amazing MLK was, I don't really need your words. I need your actions. You talked about how the Texas House, how we made sure that we follow through with actions. I don't want to be coddled. I want to see actions. If you believe that you were legitimately elected, if you believe that the people really want you there, then you should not be afraid of the people having their say-so and being able to participate in the election process. If you believe that the civil rights movement was something that it was worth MLK dying for and that we really made progress in this world, then we need to go ahead and honor his legacy in what we do, not what we say. And my last thing that I'm going to say is that I need people to understand how much MLK did in his very short life. He was younger than I am today when he was assassinated. And so I don't want anyone to ever believe that they are too young to be involved and get out there and fight for what they know is right. I think that's what we saw with young people when they pushed back and made sure that they showed up to the polls in record numbers. And I'm counting on that next generation to keep up this fight and keep the fire going.
Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, David Jolly, Jason Johnson, thank you so much for having this conversation with us and for starting us off this hour. I'm grateful to all of you.